President Trump has threatened to impose new tariffs on Mexico with the goal of prompting Mexico to be more aggressive in addressing undocumented immigration into the United States. Some high-profile Republicans slammed the move as a, quote, misuse of presidential tariff authority. The Wall Street Journal reported that Mr. Trump's top trade advisor, Bob Lighthizer, also opposed the plan, arguing that it could jeopardize the ratification of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. Jerry, what does this mean for U.S. consumers?
Well, first of all, it's a very big deal. I mean, Mexico is the second largest provider of imports to the U.S. after China. So there's all kinds of stuff that comes in. In particular, it's harmful to the auto industry because lots of parts that are put in American-made cars come from Mexico. So price of cars goes up, price of Mexican produce at the restaurant or the grocery store goes up, the appliance that you might buy might have been made in Mexico, that cost goes up. So there's a lot of impact for consumers. There's also potential follow-on impact if this actually happens and Mexico responds by putting tariffs of its own on, then that's going to affect farmers who like to ship products to Mexico. One footnote, though, this is not happening immediately. That the president has said, I will put these on effective June 10th unless, if Mexico doesn't
5%
act.
on all goods
Right.
starting June 10th, then 5% in addition every month.
Every month until you hit 25%, which would be very onerous. But there's a period of time here for Mexico to do something that allow President Trump to back off. And we've seen this sometimes in the China trade dispute. There's a threat, there's a panic. The president puts a deadline and then sees enough progress to say, oh, I succeeded, I convinced them to act, and he backs off.
Why did he act now?
That's a question I'm not sure I can answer. What I can say is that obviously this has been in a White House that's been trying to really make a case that there's a crisis on the border and has been using everything from changes in asylum to obviously now trade policy to make that case. I will say this, I was on the call with the White House officials as they were announcing this, and one of the key questions people asked is, well, what can Mexico do to make sure that these tariffs don't happen, or at least that they don't increase? There were no clear goalposts from the White House. So you have a very clear punitive action. It's going to be this date and 5%, then 10%. But they don't say, okay, well, if border apprehensions go down by 5%, then we'll pull this back. Or if we have less people in custody, then we'll pull that back. So what you have is a vague successful goal, or a vague goal for success. And Mexico could pretty much do anything, and Trump could say, okay, you know what, I'm okay, I'm moved, we'll take this away. Or say, they didn't do enough, we're going to 25%.
Well, Jerry said if this happens, and I think that's a real question. Because
Why do you say that?
Because, well, for one thing, the president's made threats before to do drastic things like this, and then not done them. And he often does them at a moment when he wants to change what we are talking about. So what are we talking about this week? We're talking about the Mueller's announcement, and we're also talking about the controversy over trying to shield the president from having to see the ship in Japan that was named the USS McCain. Those are both stories on which he was not getting a lot of defenders. And now we're talking about trade and an issue he would much prefer us to be talking about.
And that his base would like to hear about.
Yeah.
And we're seeing the president use emergency powers. Very controversial, even among Republicans. It's raising questions about the executive branch and going into the national security area.
Well, I mean, one of the great things about politics, or maybe one of the worst things about politics, is that your view of executive power depends very much in this country on who happens to be the executive at the time. You know, there's this battle over how much authority the president has on a whole number of fronts. And frankly, Attorney General Bill Barr is a big proponent of as much executive power as possible. And that helps Trump in a number of ways. And one of the ways that you've seen him, you know, become very close to Trump very quickly, in a way that frankly a lot of other cabinet officials have struggled and failed to do, is that Trump seems to really like his Attorney General already. And a lot of that is because a lot of what Barr is doing is to the benefit of the president. And for Democrats, they see that as you know, very dangerous and alarming. And Trump finally feels he has a real defender, a real lawyer in the Justice Department.
Does this upend the USMCA, the new version of NAFTA that sits in Nancy Pelosi's hands on Capitol Hill?
Well, that's one of the real dangers. As you suggested, that's one of the reasons some of President Trump's top advisors said don't do this, because it puts the ratification of the new trade agreement in jeopardy, both here and in Mexico. Because in Mexico, this sort of thing stirs up nationalist sentiment, which is very clear, close to the surface anyway in Mexico. And there's a chance the legislature down there says, nope, we're not going to do any deals with the U.S. under these circumstances. And here, it kind of gives Democrats an excuse to vote against a trade agreement they're not sure they like that much anyway. So yeah, I think it creates a political problem for an agreement that's very close to the president's heart.